Welcome to the Accidental Experts podcast. I'm your host, Bryce Hamilton. I'm a licensed clinical social worker and a child and family therapist. I have been in practice for over 15 years, and I'm also a mom of 4. So I know the challenges both professionally and personally. I'm so glad that you're here today to grow your parenting toolbox. Please come as you are and be ready to learn. My goal is to make you the accidental expert so that you can raise healthy humans. Hi guys, welcome back. I'm so glad that you're here today. Today we are going to talk to Lee Wagner, and she is going to talk to us about taking care of ourselves. This is such an important part of life, is being the parent who is taking care of ourselves, even though it's super, super hard. So Lee is a dietitian with a PhD in medical nutrition science. She specializes in women's health and integrative functional nutrition. She's in private practice and primarily works with clients with digestive problems, hormone related symptoms, fatigue, and chronic pain. So she's going to give us some tidbits today to help us understand how to better take care of ourselves.
It's really fun to be here and talk about how we can feel good as parents, which we're so focused on our kids that sometimes we forget that we have needs too.
I know. Yes. And I literally as a mom, sometimes I forget that I'm like, oh, I haven't eaten today. Oh my gosh,
Exactly.
I've been taking care of, everybody else has been fed. Everybody's at school. Everybody's where they need to be. And I'm like, I feel kind of dizzy. I didn't eat. Yes. Right. This is so crazy, but real.
Yeah. And it's so simple, but not really easy, which is so many things in the lifestyle, medicine or health world where it's these ideas are very simple, but the execution is not always so easy to do. So hopefully the conversation will unfold and give people some tangible takeaways.
Yeah. Okay. So what do you think contributes to feeling good in our own bodies as parents? So when we're thinking about us feeling good, what are the parts that make that happen?
So, as I was thinking about this, there's so many different things that can make us feel good. And even as a person who specializes, as a dietitian who specializes in personalizing care for people, I can't say that I could answer that for any one person because we all have a different idea of what good is. But in terms of how we can, what I think about is how we can feel good in our bodies is how we can just be pain-free or at least minimize pain. So a lot of that relates to lowering inflammation in the body. If we're talking about the biochemical feeling good. So that what we've learned about chronic inflammation is that there are a lot of contributing factors, and chronic inflammation is different than acute inflammation. I will not bore you with the specific scientific details, but mostly what we're talking about when we're talking about just general diseases, chronic diseases, is more chronic inflammation. And so food and nutrition is one of the main ways we've learned can help either promote chronic inflammation or minimize chronic inflammation. So that's one of the ways. And interestingly, sleep and stress can also contribute to inflammation. Things that we don't always have control over when we're parents, because we are often dictated by the people who depend on us. So I don't mean to make it seem oversimplistic, but fueling well, which we can talk about what that looks like a little more specifically, even though that is going to vary by individual. Prioritizing sleep. So I used to teach grad classes at University of Kansas Med Center. And when I would teach about inflammation and nutrition, I always taught the fact that we could have the quote unquote perfect diet, which really doesn't exist, but a healthy whole food based diet. And if we're not sleeping well, which parenting, that's just a variable we can't always control. But if we're not sleeping well, we can have inflammation independent of how healthy our other lifestyle practices are, like eating well and exercising and, all the things that we know that we're supposed to do. So even prioritizing sleep, which if that, in certain phases of parenthood means trying to go to sleep even a few minutes earlier than we otherwise would, can have a huge impact on us feeling good in our bodies. And some of us are more aware of that. That's another piece of us feeling good in our bodies is what's called interoceptive awareness, which is having an awareness of what's going on in our bodies, like our digestion, signals of hunger and fullness, knowing when we have pain or not, which seems so like, of course, but not all of us have interoceptive awareness. Not all of us are tuned into our bodies. And I think that's another really important piece of us feeling good in our bodies is that awareness, which when we're getting pulled in so many directions as parents can be really hard to do. But learning that skill, just like so many things in parenting, learning that skill in ourselves can help our kids be aware of what's going on in their bodies. So that's another piece of how I work with clients is not only eating well, because like that can be just so hard to grasp in just when we're thinking of like healthy eating, because our culture really confuses us about it because of diets. But the other piece of it is awareness in our body. And I think that contributes to us being able to feel good in our body because we know what's going on.
So maybe that's something as simple as like taking a moment to check in, to be like, how am I feeling? Am I tired? Am I hungry? Am I thirsty? Right? Like to just slow down, because sometimes I think we're just like so fast. We're just like moving through things so intensely or so quickly that we don't even stop to like check in with our bodies.
Yep. And like what you said, after you've gotten all your kids where they need to be and fed and all of that, and then you're like, I feel kind of dizzy. You could interpret that as, oh, something's wrong with me. Or you could think, oh, well, I haven't eaten. Like I fed everyone else and I haven't eaten. So it could be something that simple. I mean, it always could be something else. And I try not to make everything go back to food and nutrition, even though that is my specialization. But the other side, there certainly can be more serious things, but often it's like, we haven't taken care of ourselves and we just need that quick check-in.
Yeah, to do that. Because I think you're right. I mean, we do take such good care of the other people that are dependent on us, which is necessary because they do depend on us. But we also have to be taking care of ourselves and having a good model of that for our kids of like, I don't want my daughters to grow up and then treat themselves not well. And so I'm trying always to treat myself well and talk nicely about myself and give myself compliments or be like, I'm really proud of myself for doing this, or this was really hard, but I like persevered. And my boys too, but like, you know, especially the girls, like, and when I do that where I haven't eaten, I'm like, oh, that wasn't like, I need to eat. And I'll be like, oh, I feel like this, to just like notice it to my kids so that I'm like getting them to notice their body signs. There's just like so much of this that goes into parenting of like all of the pieces.
And another thing, I'd say like a third thing that comes to mind when we're talking about feeling good in our bodies is when possible, trying to get ourselves out of that fight or flight sympathetic nervous system, because it doesn't just have to do with like being in fight or flight and constantly like going. Again, that can sometimes, especially in I think our culture in America, it's just kind of built into how we do things. But it can also impact our digestion, because the nickname of the sympathetic nervous system is that fight or flight. I know I don't need to explain this to you, but I bet others might be curious. And then the nickname of its complement is the parasympathetic nervous system's nickname is rest and digest. And so another problem that I find with people that I work with, parents that I work with, is that their digestion is off, which can be for so many different reasons. But one of those reasons, when it gets locked up or if it's really fast, can be that we're in the sympathetic nervous system overdrive and we're not in that state of our nervous system or supporting that state of our nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system, that is all about resting and digesting, which means that we're getting more out of the foods that we're eating. So that's another key piece of feeling good in our bodies is,
so how do we do that? How do we do that? How do we get our parasympathetic nervous system turned on versus us being in fight or flight all the time as parents?
One of the most simple things that has, support in the literature is like breathing. Belly breathing, box breathing are two. And I have you can find little 2-minute videos on YouTube to teach box breathing. I know that for every individual and people who have mental health conditions, that ability might vary. So I don't want to pretend like I'm an expert in this. But that is one of like the most simple things we can do is slow down and take, 10 belly breaths or do 10 cycles of box breathing where we're going in, breathing in for a few seconds, let's say 4 seconds, holding it for those 4 seconds, releasing or exhaling 4 seconds and then holding, and then doing that 10 times. And you might even notice after 5 cycles of just doing that you can feel your nervous system shift. And that's something you can do when you're in the car driving. Like, it doesn't have to be something where you're like on a pillow in a quiet room. Okay, I love that idea. I'd love for anybody who can build that in, great, to like actually do some meditation or yoga. Yoga is another way that, as the part of the exercise or movement, I mean, the key of it is the breathing. So that's another way that we can do that. Anything that's going to get us on the quieter end of the spectrum, rather than like problem solving, going, doing, that's what's helping us shift into that parasympathetic nervous system.
Yeah. And so when I pick up my kids from school and I'm sitting in the carpool line, this is when I do box breathing, and that I build it into my schedule, and I also floss my teeth then. So I'm so sorry, anybody else who is watching, but like, it's like, I'm so busy. I'm like, sometimes I don't think about that part. And so then I'm like, my dental hygienist is like, floss your teeth while you're waiting in carpool line. I was like, oh, I can totally do that. Yes. And that sounds like so silly, but it's like those things where we're taking care of ourselves. And I try to build that in. And there are days where I don't pick up my kids from carpool line. And so then it's like, if I have a patient cancellation, right, or I get to the office early, and I am constantly trying to regulate to the calm, right, of just like being in a calm headspace. I feel like I'm a better parent when I am in a calm headspace, right? Like, that fight or flight makes me the worst version of myself as a parent, right? Because I am not using my whole frontal lobe, which is where we make all of our decisions and our thoughts. Yeah. And I'm just using my reptilian brain, which is fight, flight, freeze, fawn. I don't have a lot of choices, and that doesn't really meet my kids where they need me to be. And so, yeah, that's a great idea. I also love nature. Like, getting out in nature is very helpful. It's so restorative, totally. Even if it's, like, sometimes I'll just like put out a blanket in my backyard and lay down and look up at the trees and just like notice, even if I can't get to a park or a hike or whatever, of just like being present in nature.
Absolutely. It's another great idea, because it can just be going outside. It doesn't even have to be doing anything like special. Like you said, just getting outside, and it's going to be different for everyone, and just start with something small, because it's often, as parents, we don't feel like we have that any extra time to do anything special. So simple is going to be the theme for today, I think.
Yeah.
Simplifying.
Yes. I mean, because that's how it's approachable, right? It's really hard when it's like something that we have to do 12 steps for. I mean, you're going to lose me at step 2. It's too many. Yeah. What mindless things do you think we do as parents that actually are negatively impacting our health?
Well, you brought up one of the items just off the bat, which is like forgetting to eat. So again, because we're so focused on other people, that's something that I find, like, people having a slump in the middle of their day. I will say, I think there is a natural rhythm of a slump at that 3 o'clock time that I think is circadian based. I don't necessarily, sometimes it can be worsened by how we eat or don't eat around lunchtime. So like, if we have something that is not balanced, or is just like not enough or not balanced, we can have that slump that can be worse, partly because we get a blood sugar crash. And then we can also just feel that slump just naturally. But what I find is that people will maybe eat breakfast. I mean, intermittent fasting and like the popularity of that has really changed that people not eating basically during times. What I would, a lot of what I think about nutrition, there's the biochemical stuff when we get into the vitamins and minerals and, micronutrients that is so essential. And that's a big part of my job to know. But then there's like the really simple things, like, when we're talking about people doing intermittent fasting, which for some I think can be appropriate. And for most of us, just not eating when it's dark can be helpful, but it also can be kind of, I try to get people to zoom out. So like, just zoom out. If we're not eating during the main hours, where we're doing the majority of our thinking, activities, that doesn't really make sense. We ideally should be fueling the hours that we are doing all the things we're doing. People will come to me, they're so exhausted. And, at a very cursory, like very simple level, I'm like, well, you haven't eaten until 3. Like, you think you're going to feel good, or they have a little something in the morning and then they start, then that energy starts waning and it's like, that wasn't enough. And it's like, I just have to tell. It's usually not always that simple, but sometimes it is.
Yeah.
So there's the forgetting to eat. And then sometimes on the flip side, the mindless eating, where we're just eating what scraps kids have left, or we're just trying to, and often like when people aren't eating throughout the waking hours, during the hours where I would think we need to be fueling, and then they're eating all of the majority of their food right before they go to bed, which is, again, it just doesn't make sense. We should be fueling the hours of our activity and where we need our brain power, and we should be fasted. And that's it's just a technical term, honestly, but we don't need that necessarily, that big bunch of food right before we're going to sleep. Of course, we need the calories if we haven't eaten the whole day. But mindless eating is another piece where it is a mindless thing that we're doing, where we often aren't making conscious choices about what we're eating. It's just like your body, like your brainstem perceives that it needs the calories and it doesn't really care what they are. And that's where, if we can get our prefrontal cortex or our frontal lobe engaged, and like think about, oh, what's actually going to make me feel good, then that gets us out of that mindless eating. And then, again, hanging out in fight or flight is another thing that we do mindlessly, I think out of necessity. So I don't want people to like blame themselves or have like another reason of like, oh, I can't be in this go mode. You have to be sometimes. So
sure.
Those are some of the things. And then, this is just like a sign of our times, but anything that's attention stealing or time stealing, like our devices, is just not making people feel well. And it can contribute to a lot of different aspects where we could have time to get a little workout in, or we could have time to make a batch of something that we could put in the freezer during that time. So those are a few of the things.
Yeah. Well, it's funny that you say about the slump about 3 o'clock. So several months ago, I've noticed this my whole life, probably. That I can remember, like as being an adult, that like in the afternoons, I want something like candy sweet or whatever. And it's like, I have a friend who has been like, eat protein at that time. Right. But it's like, I know that like knowledge base. And I'm like, that makes me feel so much better. But sometimes my brain is like, eat sugar. It will make you feel better right now. And so I started giving myself a reminder on my watch at 3 o'clock. It says, skip the sugar. And it has been really helpful for me, because I'm like, oh yeah, like I totally was feeling that, even though I may not like do something with that. Like I can find myself in that place of like, I'm needing a little bit more protein. So I grab a handful of nuts or something, and then I'm like, oh, I feel so much better. And that part is really helpful. But I think we all can be in that kind of like place of like, we're not thinking about it. And then the mindless eating of like, I can find myself being like starving when I get home from work, if I worked a long day, and I'm like, I'm ready for dinner like the second that I'm done seeing people in my office. But dinner is not necessarily going to be right there. So it's like eating something with protein before I head home, so that when I get home, I'm not grabbing the chips, because those are like super easy, or something, right? Carrots just don't really sound that great at that time, right? So it's like having something prepared, or cheese or whatever, like that's like more protein derived. Do you think that that's a good kind of strategy to be like going for the protein, or like knowing your weak moments and having a prayer, like being a little bit prepared?
Absolutely. So something like that, like having a snack that is more balanced, and then also kind of preempting, or so that you're not getting to that point. Like if you know your time is 3 o'clock, having that alarm at 2:30, so that you're not even like having that negotiation at that time, or even reevaluating what your lunch is. Do you need to eat a little bit more? Again, I think that natural slump is so common, and that urge to like have a little something, often sweet. or for some, like a salty snack that isn't going to like necessarily stick with you. For some too, that can be a really good time to do a walk around the block if you can, or around the building or wherever you are. That's not always accessible, but sometimes it's not even that you're hungry. You just get a little, depending on kind of what's going on in your body, which I could get into some nerdy stuff like cortisol and that piece, but like even just, as you have more interoceptive awareness, more awareness of what signals are telling you in your body, sometimes you've eaten enough and it actually was balanced, or maybe it wasn't so balanced and you're kind of on the downslide of a crash, of a blood sugar crash. You could actually go out either right after you've had that meal and have a quick little walk to help support digestion, help support blood sugar regulation, kind of anticipate that you might have a crash if you don't. Or again, setting that little timer a few minutes earlier than when you usually have that urge or that energy crash, so that you can even like head it off.
Because none of us feel good when we're hangry, if that's where we're going, right? And so it's like the quick sugar gives us like a reprieve from that, but doesn't really work very long. So it's like being like, maybe it's planning our snacks like we plan our kids' snacks, right? Too, of like being aware of that preparation. I mean, that's the part that's hard is that piece, but then it pays off, right? Like everybody, there's more harmony, right? In the household when parents are fed, kids are fed, right? Like no one's getting to the place where their blood sugar is low, because it is hard to bounce back from that.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. Once that horse is out of the barn, it's hard to get it back in.
Oh my gosh, so hard. So, what other quick suggestions do you have for parents around food?
Around food, I would say keeping it simple and not judging yourself. Like there's so much judgment and like self-judgment and judgment of each other around food and around everything involving parenting. So I think as simple as you possibly can keep it, both in how you're preparing it, what you're preparing. So what we know about a healthy diet pattern is that the more, it's like not rocket science, but like the more whole foods that we eat, that's a pattern that is going to contribute to more balanced blood sugar, that's going to contribute to more stable energy, that's going to contribute to less inflammation, that's going to, contribute to so many things health-wise. So fewer ingredients, and meaning that the foods that you're preparing are things that are just those foods. So I can't count the number of times that we've just had a meal of, leftovers that we like pulled out of the freezer that we had batch cooked, or frying some eggs, or, reheating steamed vegetables or frozen vegetables. So it doesn't have to be this like elaborate meal with all these different components. In fact, it could be like sometimes what our meal is for ourselves and our daughter is just like a chili that also has vegetables in it and, the protein. So it, as it's on its own, is something balanced and complete. And you're not having to do 3 to 5 different, components of it. The other thing that I always want people to just remember is that it's kids eating changes constantly. So what their acceptability of the food is going to change. So when we're in a good spell of like, she's eating, I have a 1-year-old daughter, like when she's eating everything and like loving it all, I know that that's probably next week not going to be the same thing, but continuously showing those foods, even giving variety is helpful for all of us to just have more enjoyment out of food. But just knowing that like, just because they refuse one meal doesn't mean, or a food, that they're not going to accept it 2 days later. And the flip side, that they might refuse it, but not to get too worked up about any one food or meal that they're having.
Yeah. Well, and something I like to do at my house around food, because we have 4 kids and a very busy lifestyle, is I like to cook a bunch of things ahead of time and doing the batch cooking, like you said. And so it's like, I'll grill like a ton of chicken breasts, and it's like, we'll use chicken breasts for salad. We'll use chicken breasts to make chicken Parmesan, but it's just like grilled chicken with sauce and some cheese and right. Like just those different things where it's like, how many meals can I make this out of? Right. Or chicken tacos, like, we just do that so that it's simple and there's not a lot of thought, because I know that we are likely in our house to go for something that is not as balanced and not as fueling when we are pressed for time. Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I mean, like, I love breakfast for dinner. Like if all else fails,
Yes.
like not cereal, because cereal is like at least for me is like the up and the down, but like
Totally.
eggs or, like bacon or like doing that kind of thing, or a breakfast sandwich. Like we love those kind of things where it's like, okay, it is too much to do whatever today. We're going to skip that and we're going to do this instead and just have some fresh fruit. And so you said we were talking about whole foods. Will you define what that means exactly?
So what I mean when I say whole foods are just the, fruits, vegetables, beans, nuts, seeds, grains, meat, poultry, fish, seafood. Like they are the ingredients that make up. It's the most complete. One physician that I worked with when I worked in a clinic at KU Med years ago, would say like the food that's like closest to the sun. So like as you get food further in the scientific literature, the peer reviewed literature, it's called ultra processed food, which is the really highly processed, like, chips and muffins and cookies and cakes and all of that stuff, candy, soda. So that's far away from the sun. That's had a lot of processing. And I'm not against processed foods. We have processed foods in our home on a daily basis. Baby carrots are a processed food. Like there's a lot of foods that would be considered processed that are whole, healthy and balanced. Whole foods are just, the simplest form of the food. And what I say, either the sun has shined down and grown the food, or the animal, depending on if you're vegetarian or not, or the animal, eats that food. And then we're eating, whether it's meat, poultry, eggs, and dairy that come from those animals as well. So keeping it as that short distance. That's just what we've learned based on a lot of, well, I guess it depends on what you consider a lot of years of research, but we do have a lot of evidence in the nutrition field that whole foods are generally the ones that are contributing to lower levels of chronic inflammation, lower risk of these chronic diseases that are common: diabetes, heart disease, cancers, things like that.
Yeah. Well, and when you think about, I know that there's a lot of diets, right? Like where people are pushing a certain agenda, but I think when we think about foods and where we came from as a species, right? Like we were hunting and gathering, right? So like the things that are simpler, that's probably what our bodies are used to. We didn't have a thing like Cheetos. Those didn't exist, right? And so it's like, it's not that that's bad. It's about balance, right? I think everything in moderation is a healthy kind of concept to have. Of you don't want to just eat blueberries. I mean, blueberries are great, but if you have a whole diet of organic blueberries, I mean, you're
missing a lot of nutrients.
Yes, right. You're missing out on a lot of other things. So I think it's important when we're thinking about our kids, but also ourselves, of like just balance, right? Like you have the bag of Cheetos. Okay, cool. Do it.
Yep.
Right. But it's like just looking at the whole picture of maybe this week, how did we do around food? Like, are we getting enough protein? Are we getting enough vegetables, fruits? Like, is that a good perspective to have?
Yeah. And to understand that those foods, like Cheetos is a really great example, that food scientists created for us to want to eat the whole bag and to still feel hungry, so that maybe we would buy another bag. It's technically termed the bliss point. There was probably about 10, 15 years ago, there was this big kind of reporting on this exact thing in food, in the food industry. And so those foods are kind of ways that we bypass our natural mechanisms of hunger and satiety, like feeling hungry and then feeling satisfied and full, which we've learned a lot more about as these new weight loss drugs have like exploded in their popularity. And I'm not going to go down that road. But what I think is important to know is the whole foods in their, and frozen is just as healthy as fresh. So it's not like, I think that people need to be like gardening and, doing all of the labor to like grow all of your food or raise all of your food. If that's something that's important to you and you enjoy that, awesome. And I think that's so great. But most of us don't have or want to have the time or want to do that. But the whole foods give us this feedback of satiety. We stop eating because we feel full enough when we get enough protein, when we get enough fiber, when we have healthy fats and oils, when we have them in these whole food forms. And so then we get that natural feedback loop of, I feel hungry, I'm going to eat, I ate enough of this balanced meal, I'm going to stop eating. And then we have this rhythm throughout the day. When we eat primarily ultra processed foods, we don't get those same signaling mechanisms. We don't have that same feedback. So then we don't have as clear of signals of what's making us feel satisfied. Mm-hmm. And so that's where I think, yes, everything in moderation and don't demonize foods. I have a real personal passion in my work to make sure to minimize risk of disordered eating and eating disorders. And I think when we do demonize certain foods or say this is toxic or this is bad, then our kids are hearing us say these things. Mm-hmm. And then they start putting value and judgment on them as well. So I don't want to demonize the processed foods. However, we have to understand that they aren't giving us that same information the way that whole foods do.
Yeah. That's a really good thought process to have of like just being conscious of those things. And excuse me, fascinating that I feel like I remember hearing about like there was information that was coming to light that the food industry of ultra pasteurized or ultra processed foods was kind of having to share some information about like they are doing these things on purpose to make us want to consume their product more. And that, that's infuriating, really. But I also understand it's an industry. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And that's the thing. And I being in the nutrition world, there's just so much noise and arguing. And to me, it's frustrating because so for example, there's like all of this conversation, or at least a little bit right now on, dietitians getting funded and their messaging being, funded by big food. And I think, that is something that we need to be aware of and concerned about. And at the same time, I think, part of that is trying to not demonize any certain foods. And also food industry, their motivation is to make a lot of money. And so we all have to have a livelihood. There is a key piece of like both understanding that food industry is trying to make foods so that we consume a lot of them, which means that we can't get too full on them, because if it is something that's too satiating, we're not going to buy as much of that thing. Mm-hmm. And then at the same time, understanding that those foods also can be part of just life and enjoyment. And food is not just about fuel and lowering inflammation. It's also about fun and family and socialization. So, social events. And I don't want people to feel so like food has to be just all about balancing blood sugar and biohacking. Mm-hmm. It's so much more.
Yeah. And that's why I love family dinners, is like that meal of like sharing food. And we have a behavior at dinner where we like everybody gets asked questions and we go around and everybody answers them, which makes it fun. Right. And I think then we're also like pacing our eating, right? It like helps us to like slow down. Right. And so like, it's all these kind of things where it's like, it's really fun, but also it's like creating conversation and connection, right? Which is so important. Mm-hmm. And that's what kids remember about their childhood is connection. The toys we buy or the things we get them are not oftentimes the things that they really remember. It's the time they spent with us. And that's what they really want, which is why I love family dinner. But I also know that for every family, that's not possible every night, but just like making an effort to like sit down or have your kids help you cook or, like just all these different ways to make food fun.
Yes, absolutely. And I even like the idea, like family dinners are so important for so many reasons. But even independent of what you're serving at the meal, to have that time to connect is so important for all of our health. So
meaning it doesn't have to be a home cooked meal in order to sit down to eat together. Yeah,
exactly.
I love that. Yeah. So what quick suggestions do you have around physical movement? Because I think that physical movement is part of having a healthy mind, but also like it's part of digestion, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So certainly things that I find so helpful, if we're just talking about how we're going to support digestion, one of the simplest things we could do is just taking a little walk, or even doing, standing. I follow a scientist. She's extremely popular, Rhonda Patrick. She has a PhD in, I think, biochemistry. And she was reporting on some recent research where just people doing like every 45 minutes, doing like 10 weights, like body weight squats, meaning like you're just doing squats as you're from standing, like you're not holding any weights, you're not going to the gym, and that helping support blood sugar and, just our metabolism. So when people talk about metabolism at its very core sense is just how we turn fuel into energy and that our bodies can use. So simple, finding something that you enjoy, finding something that you can, do consistently. And then the other thing is getting the help that you need. Like if you haven't been exercising in 10 years, or maybe you've never had a habit of physical activity, don't just go to the gym and kill yourself for a day and then hurt yourself. Work with somebody who knows how the body can and should move, or even like working with a physical therapist to assess if you do have back problems or something like that, going to a professional who can make sure that as you get going, you're doing it in a safe way. So those would be some simple things. And then taking a walk. There's no easier, I shouldn't say for some people walking is not easy. So I don't want to pretend like that's true, but it's accessible. You can go out, for a lot of people, you can go out your door, you can walk down the street and back, you can walk around the block, and that does a lot for blood sugar and energy as well.
Yeah. I remember when I had a newborn and I was afraid to leave the house, like when our first child was born, I would run up and down the stairs, not actually like the day we were born, right? Like way after I had like been released for activity, but I was like, I don't want to like leave, but then I would like walk up and down the stairs, or like, like just those kind of things of just like getting movement, even if you can't leave your house and you have access to stairs, right? Or like, sometimes where we live, it's snowing and it's not possible to like really trek with all the kids in, a foot of snow. But I think, just like those kind of things, but I love the body weight of just like, you just like doing that, or like it's moving your arms, or it's like even doing like a modified jumping jack or something where you're like stepping out and putting your hands up and then, right. Like it's just doing one thing, right? Movement is good, but also it helps with our bowels, right? When we're talking about digestion, right? And to get the poop moving, right? We've got to have some type of movement. So if you're slow in that area, this might be a good place to also incorporate some movement to help with.
Totally. That's one of the key pieces of like people whose digestion is irregular or on the slower end. People are like, well, I chug a lot of water. Well, water is only one component of the things that help keep digestion moving among many other things. But that physical activity is a key piece to getting that movement of the digestive tract. So absolutely.
Yeah. So what do you think are the things that are helping you as a mom to meet your own personal goals about self-care and nutrition?
So it's ever changing. And I will say some of the things that are working for me are things that may not work for everyone. These are just personally like things that help me be able to be healthy and well. So for one thing, just to kind of like, we have childcare, we do take our daughter to daycare. So that gives that kind of block of time where I can do my job and, where I can build in exercise, if I want to, or, other things that are important to my, personal self-care. I can cook a little bit before I go pick up my daughter, from daycare. And then the other thing that I have that may not be the case for everyone is just having a supportive partner. So those are two things that I think are just important to almost like lay as groundwork that is just specific to me, but, more subjective things that like we do as, partnership is always checking in with each other to make sure that we have like what we need, or even staying in tune with each other and knowing when somebody needs like to tap out, giving breaks, things that I would say I am more probably aware of than than Rob, my partner. But like what things are important to us. So for me, it's going to really vary. For me, I'm motivated by feeling good in my body. I like feeling rested. I like not having pain. But for some people that is not a motivator. They would rather, so like for my husband, he likes that as well, but he was more probably motivated by, he's an artist. So he likes having that outside of his work. He's like, I would feel like if I only did my job that I wouldn't feel, so we have to make sure that he can get some painting and drawing time in. So I think it's being able to do those things for us. It's also keeping it very simple and both contributing, agreeing that as a partnership, we both contribute to the preparation of food and other household things, but like cleaning up as well. So that's another thing that helps us be prioritizing the things we want for our health. So for me, I would rather take a walk with a friend. He would rather go to the gym. So understanding those things within a family and helping each other, that's what's working for us right now. And I know that as our daughter gets older, that's going to ever change, and we're going to have to keep checking in and seeing what's working and what's not working. But those would be, contributing, from a really simple standpoint of cooking, like you said, batch cooking, certain things like muffins, pancakes, pasta sauces, stews and chilies that we can just pull out and thaw, and we don't have to cook every single meal. And I don't cook every single meal, from scratch. I don't want to be doing that. Some people like to cook in that way, but I'm just throwing sometimes things into the microwave that I've made 3 weeks ago.
Yeah. Well, and I love to cook. Like it is totally a stress reliever for me, but I can't do it every night. We have 4 kids going in lots of different directions. Sometimes we have like homework things or just life dynamics of like had a problem at school with one of the kids, right? Like we need to help solve that part. So it's like being able to give yourself the space to do that too, of like, I like when we have leftovers that I'm like, oh, we're not going to get through this. Like I cooked too much. I'm like, freeze it right away. And then be able to like eat it later, because I don't want you to be so tired of it. And also it's like a whole new meal 2 weeks from now. So yes, I love this idea of doing things ahead of time. It's hard, but maybe it's also sitting down with who lives in your house and talking about it, right? Like communicating about this, like, hey, we want to do this. Or if you have a kid who's old enough to start cooking, incorporating them into that part of like teaching them and be like, okay, Tuesdays are your day. Like you tell me what you want to make, and I'll buy all the ingredients, and to share the responsibility.
I love that. Absolutely. I mean, that's like a dream for me that my daughter would be able to contribute. And I'm even holding her, I mean, as safely as I possibly can when I'm stirring things and prepping stuff, so she can see, even if she doesn't really understand what's going on. And then she's stirring in her little bowl with her, little like balls that she has. And I'm already seeing her do little things that we're doing around the house. So incorporating them as much as possible. And that goes for, even if you want them to start eating certain things, even if you just grew like a tomato or something in a little plant, like, or in little pot, or a pepper or some basil this summer, or mint, that when they're involved in the food part of it, they're much more likely to try things. I know. And I'm not a picky eating expert, so I don't want to pretend like I have expertise there, but I do know that the more that they're involved, that the more likely they are to.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's how it's been for my raising of the 4 kids too, is that part. But I think, I mean, it's just, there's a lot to consider, right? And no one thing works for every single family, but just thinking about like, what are the simple things? How can you make your life a little bit easier? And the more easy we make it, the less stressed we are. At least that's what I noticed for myself. And I know that when my stress level is high, then I'm not able to be my best self. And I don't like how it feels in that place. So the more that I can prepare ahead of time, it's a good model to show my kids, right? Like preparation is good. And even with my ADHD, that part is hard, but I make it a system, and then that's easier to implement. But then it seems like they're noticing that piece, right? Of doing things ahead of time, being a last minute doesn't feel good, but food, I mean, we all have to eat. And so the more that we can plan things out, the easier it is for sure. So what do you want parents to take away from this conversation that we've had? We've covered a lot of bases here and on a lot of different things. What do you want them to take away?
So I think, very simply just understanding that what you need or want in terms of your health and well-being is going to be different than, anyone else in your family. It might be different than other parents around you. So, trying to trust that you know what's best for you and know that it might look differently. So we're kind of out of this season. Maybe we're getting into it because it's getting into summer and sometimes people are trying to like lose weight first swimsuit. But I think that January time of year when people are like dieting and you're seeing other people going on diets and you're feeling tempted to do something like that, that's more extreme, trying to really tune into focusing on how different foods and meals are making you feel. Like, even if you don't really know what healthy eating is, because it can be such a subjective thing. Even just paying attention to, after this meal, I feel hungry this, soon after I have this breakfast, this makes me feel hungry 30 minutes later. This breakfast makes me feel full until lunch. Like, that is helpful information for you. So kind of tuning into your own body and tuning out the noise around you is like probably one of the simplest things that you could do. And when we do eat, kind of, as you start shifting toward eating more whole, balanced meals, you might notice, and this is kind of a key to how I approach nutrition, is like, it can help you be more efficient and even just present in your life because your energy is more predictable. It's more, so as you're taking care of yourself, you're actually taking care of your family by feeling better and not having to like constantly like, oh, got to drive through Starbucks because we need another sugar caffeine hit. That is energy. Like, it is technically energy, but it's not sustainable energy. So, doing what's best for you is going to look different than other people. Don't get tempted by people's, diets, that, especially if they seem extreme. And then 2, I would say one meal is not going to make or break your health. It's not going to make or break your family's health. So again, don't get worked up if you don't have all meals whole and prepared. Even give yourself permission to go get food from somewhere that's already ready to go, that you don't feel like you have to be constantly cooking or pulling stuff out that you've made. You can eat out. One meal is not going to make or break your health. And then trying to focus on adding foods rather than what we want to take away. There's so much about like, you need to get rid of this food. You need to get rid of that food. You need to avoid this ingredient. And while maybe those things could potentially be helpful, instead focusing on the things that you can add, that you can include, that you could, benefit, let's say you have pizza for a meal, which is fine. What would make that a little bit healthier is if you just had like a box of salad that you grabbed a handful of and put whatever dressing you want, even if it's ranch, whatever. That's going to give you a little bit more, having some carrot sticks and hummus with it. So it's not like, oh, we can't have pizza because it's unhealthy. It's like, we're going to have this pizza. How can we make it a little bit better?
Yeah. And more balanced. Yeah. That's a great idea. Just like looking at the simple things. And I think it's about like, I think about like, if I wanted to work out today, but I didn't get to it for whatever reason, it's like, was I moving, right? Like, how can I incorporate just movement? Like, okay, I'm going to just walk around outside for a little bit. Or when the kids go to play, like, I'm going to take a turn jumping on the trampoline too. Right. And it's like, they love that and laugh at me because, it's not as awesome as them jumping, but it's those little things of just like the small stuff of like, I love the idea of like thinking about adding versus taking away. Cause I think our culture is very much about like removing versus like thinking about like, I'm going to add some bell peppers to this and have those. But it's like, also just like thinking about the intuitive eating of like, what does my body really want? And I think that part is important too, of just like, I think about like, do I want a Snickers bar or do I want an apple? And it's like, sometimes I really want the Snickers bar, right? But like a lot of times if I stop, I'm like, actually, I want an apple with peanut butter. That is actually what I really want, is that, or a smoothie that I've made at my house or whatever, smoothie at the store or whatever, like that's what I want. But it's like, I go for like the quickest, easiest thing sometimes. So I think just giving ourselves the permission and slowing down, right? Like just to think about, what do we need? Sometimes I'm thirsty when I think I'm hungry, and that tricks me too, right? Of like, just not enough water.
And that's where, practicing what you notice when you do choose the Snickers bar and seeing how you feel 30 minutes later versus when you choose the apple and peanut butter and what you feel 30 minutes later. That, even if it's not what you would perceive as like the healthy choice, just use that as an experiment. Like notice if you've never drank, 8 glasses of water, 64 ounces of water in a day, maybe you get 24 ounces, see what it would feel like. Even if you didn't get to 64, even if you had 48 ounces, even if you had a little bit more, to see what that felt like throughout the day, and not seeing it as, I have to hit this number because that's what I'm told I should. Let's just see it as, how can I experiment within what's actually doable in my life right now to see if I can feel a little bit better from it, rather than I have to go on this super extreme, I don't even want to name a diet, but a super extreme diet that, you could probably shift a million things in your life for these 3 weeks that you can follow it. But what does that really lead to, the benefits 4 months down, 4 months, 4 years down the road? You're going to see that as like, it worked. People say, well, it worked when I did it, but it was under such unrealistic circumstances that did it really work? And I would argue that, of course, you can see it in my face. Like, no, I don't think it worked. So again, trying to keep it simple, doable, and little things that you can, tag on over years is going to pay dividends more than something extreme that you can do for a short period of time.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much for your time today. This has been so informative. I have like lots of things that I'm like mulling over in my brain of like, how can I implement those little tweaks, right? To just feel better. And I think that's the important part, is just like feeling good, whatever that our definition is for ourselves. So thanks, Lee.
Thank you so much for having me.
Wow, that was a lot of really good information, Lee. I think there's a lot of things that I'm going to be considering and thinking about. And I think when we're listening to this episode, there's a lot of information. When I listen to episodes like this, where there's just so much data given and so many things, sometimes it feels really overwhelming. So I want you to just pause for a second and think about like, what's one thing that I want to do that was talked about in this podcast? Is it drinking more water? Is it eating more fruit? Is it eating more vegetables? Is it preparing meals more ahead? Is it having a schedule for eating? Is it sitting around the table? What is it that I want to do? And then do that thing. Don't get overwhelmed by all the other stuff. That stuff doesn't matter. Just choose one thing that you feel like you can implement and then do it. And if it doesn't work, try something else, right? And if you are able to master that thing, if you drink more water, because that's the thing you choose, and you're like, okay, I'm ready for something else, come back and listen to this episode again. It doesn't all have to happen in one time. And I think being kind to ourselves is so important as we're parents, and there's a lot on our plate. So taking care of ourselves is important, but also within a way that we can like tolerate and achieve. And I think that gives us better feedback to come back and do it again and again. With that, I will say thank you so much for listening today. I know that this episode was full of lots of great information. If you like what we're doing, please rate and subscribe. Share us with your friends. Follow us on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. And if you have suggestions for shows, please email us at accidentalexperts@gmail.com. Thank you so much for your time. Have a fantastic day. Some words from our legal team.
The information presented in this podcast is not intended or implied to be a substitute for appropriate professional advice, diagnosis, or treatment. All content, including text, graphics, images, and information contained on or available through this podcast, is for general information purposes only. This podcast makes no representations and assumes no responsibility for the accuracy or information on or available through this podcast, and such information is subject to change without notice. You are encouraged to confirm any information obtained through this program with other sources and review all information regarding any condition or treatment with the appropriate professionals.
What we're saying is, yes, I am a real therapist, but I'm not your therapist.